as a basis the long-term treatment with statins, but we understand that currently we have multiple opportunities to strengthen this treatment. So there could be omega-3 fatty acids, fibrates, it could be izotamib added on top, and also PCSK9 antibodies on top, also use of inclisiran. So this is a huge list, a very long list of potential options, and multiple options are available. So this is a very long list, and all of them could be used. So 2 or 3 symposia, well, I can make a mistake. I cannot recollect the whole story, but 2 or 3 symposia would be devoted to that issue. So we will dive deep into the issues of hyperlipidemia. Well, it looks like I announced the Congress from all possible sides, and now it's my greatest honor and pleasure to give the microphone to our first speaker, and this is Dmitry Kudlai, who is the Vice President of Generium Company. Microphone. Colleagues, good morning and good afternoon and good evening. Hopefully you can see me and you can hear me. Yes, it's a great honor for me to be the first speaker in the Eurasian Congress of General Medicine. And in my personal experience, I want to show you how we face classical and innovative approaches in the specific specialties where we are working in. And definitely we are more focused on biotechnology. I'm going to show you, and this is my very new slide, so what launches and what are the indications which were actively designed and developed up to 2021. And you see very strong percentage of oncology molecules, hematological projects. Please appreciate here that infectious diseases, for example, shown here, shown green, and also vaccines, they're also shown here in yellow. And they are not quite prevailing versus the situation general in the world, although Pandemia 2021 is also included here. And I think it's the first international event, and it's an honor to mention here that a week ago, first Russian biotechnological product was included into the guidelines of the WHO. These are recombinant proteins, and these are diagnostic solutions, which is called DIA-skin test. Actually, it was considered to be advantageous versus other available technologies all over the world. So currently, what we are doing, we are talking to the Global Foundation. We have negotiations in order to help diagnostic platforms to support to work for the whole world. Well, first of all, speaking about biotechnologies, and this is what I wanted to devote my presentation to. So, in fact, they could be split in between diagnostic, therapeutic, preventive, and also I could mention in this context that I'm one of the team who, for the first in the world, managed to scale up Sputnik, and also we are preparing the review, and I can show you briefly this first publication in Q1 bioengineering. So from the point of perspectives, there is a very big potential, not only RNA-based vaccines, but still peptide vaccines. Peptide vaccines, they are actually showing small advantage and particular benefits, although we all used to believe that RNA platform is going to be the most innovative and modern. So I will try to tackle all 3 directions of biotechnology and actually recollecting the COVID is going to an end, but still I want to show you biotechnological platform. So we were the third in the world, and this is the detection. This is a quantitative detection of cell immunity. Before that, working with ELISpot platform with bacterial infections and specifically for TB, we already had some success. So it was not difficult to establish this platform. And I would like to draw your attention to that because this work was focused not only on N and spike, but also segments in ORF3, ORF7, and OF. And it still gives us the opportunity of quantitative, and I once again repeat it, quantitative measuring of of immunity. And the platform is properly registered. It can be done for research purposes for some centers. It can be of some use. And it is called TIGRA test. TIGRA test. So with the mutations of coronavirus, it could be very useful due to these multiple epitopes included here. For that, we needed to design diagnostic monoclonal antibodies. So that's the brick principle presented here. And I can tell you, so when the first publication in Lancet in Sputnik was issued, and this is actually the article which reflected that it is cell immunity specifically that was built up on our platform. And this is important because in any case, we have current understanding that humoral immunity, because we actually all started measuring the antibodies, but in 30-32% it doesn't work. Humoral immunity doesn't work. So that's a gray zone. So it's a short brief. What are the interesting things we see now in diagnostic biotechnologies? So this year in Russia, and also in the January next year, we will start neonatal screening, which would be amended, and we change from 5 diseases to 36 diseases. And this is our platform on a track. So that means quantity and functionality on T and B lymphocytes was mainly focused on the congenital immunodeficiencies and was focused just for screening. And by the way, we have to mention that coronavirus infection showed how both T and B cell segments could potentially be digitalized and quantified and then assessed in dynamics. And we could see the prognosis, mild, moderate, or severe, and dynamics of treatment. So this platform for immunologists presents very big interest. So this is a pretty innovative view on that, although here we don't see something special. So that's a little bit of amended PCR, which is also automatized and doing online. And this is the clear indication. Actually, we already detected cell immunity with the institution of problems, challenges of the North, and our data absolutely meet global data, where the levels of tracks and cracks actually meet favorable or unfavorable outcome, including mortality rates. So yes, this is a big topic, so I'm not going to dive deep into here, but nevertheless. So there are very strong requirements in medicine, very high demand to multiplex system, to complex tests. And for example, when we first faced with the relevance of the topic and well, spinal muscular atrophy was promoting actively, actually that was the first sign that we had to establish immunodiagnostic platform for the quantitative tracks and cracks. And plus of that, it also worked for the quality identification of homozygote deletion of gene SMN1. So that means this multiplex diagnosticum meets the several challenges. The first one is the presence or absence particular amended exomes and other genetic pieces. And plus to that, we also had to do it in quality for SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, and the quantitative measurement of both T and B lymphocytes, so tracks and cracks. Well, we can skip it here. So this is excision rings of DNA, which are formed when they are released from the hematopoietic organs, lymphocytes. I could tell you for the coronavirus, we also used classical models, and I can't help speaking about them. So it used to be like a space for us, monoclonal antibodies, like for the whole world, But coronavirus infection gave us particular findings. We were second in the world who made monoclonal antibody eculizumab, and that was very interesting to see. So, for example, some pathophysiological aspects of thrombosis in COVID-19 and inhibitors of C5 complement were presented very specially, and this is why it was included into the guidelines, well, at least Moscow guidelines and the clinical protocols for the treatment of severe coronavirus syndrome. And it becomes already classical approach because in fact it was like orphan topic, hemolytic uremic syndrome, nocturnal hemoglobinuria. But here we have three mechanisms which are extremely relevant for severe COVID. And this is what we faced when we were working with coronavirus infection. So monoclonals, they're not a surprise anymore. And when I was preparing this presentation, I understood that I cannot meet the timing because what we are doing and what they consider to be the cutting edge of biotechnology, these are polyspecific antibodies, let's say bispecific antibodies like in oncology, and the whole world currently is demonstrating the whole breakthrough in the treatment of OLL, acute lympholeukemias, with bispecific antibodies. So our era is CD3 and CD19, CD3 BCMA. And that's interesting that beside the direct activity of the one agent, one shoulder, there is the activity of the second shoulder towards T cells. And in fact, it facilitates dramatically the effect and gives us into a plus, so about 20% of all existing effective protocols. A little bit about classical things. Russia became one of two countries in the world that has full cycle production of plasminogen activators that are indicated for the treatment of thromboembolias, treatment of MIs and strokes. I'm speaking about Revelise, which is alteplase, and tenecteplase. So this is international, not patented names, because in the forthcoming stroke day, I pay attention. That's the biggest reason of death, and these are live essential treatments. So they're from the essential drug list, and this is also strategic list, which is currently identified in the framework of national sovereignty. Also with coronavirus, so these are classical platforms that used to work in the orphan diseases like Darnaza alpha, so Tigeraza. So this is something that splits extracellular DNA, and actually they worked according to the principle of neutrophilic traps with coronavirus infection. And I can say that in terms of stability, these platforms, they're extremely challenging. So in our country, we have Darnase, amiglucerase, and other therapeutical enzymes available here for the treatment of specific syndromes like Hunter syndrome. And we use original platforms that could permit BBB, blood-brain barrier. And this is a very strong step forward because everywhere enzyme replacement therapy leads to organic compensations only, but unfortunately cognitive development, especially in pediatric age, is really reduced, deteriorated. So this is something that we don't have enough time to show, and I'm announcing it verbally. And now coming to the novelties and new things. So currently, there are more than 7,800 biotechnological products. So 70% they're potentially first in class. And as there is a driver of emergency registration through the orphanage status or number of projects, they're moving extremely fast in this context. So now we can appreciate more than 300 projects, gene-modified cell-based treatment, for CAR T, for example, and this is one of the best examples. Also gene treatment, also pure cell treatment, antisense oligonucleotides, and this is RNA-based platform, and they're preventing the production of specific proteins. So that's interesting paradigm that we experience now when we believe that CAR T is a revolution, and there is evidence-based data that this is a second line of treatment. So let's imagine when we used to think that immunological reactions would limit allergenic cell use. So now we know that the same allergenic CAR T can recognize their own cells. And there are other, let's say, statements that polygenic diseases are not curable. And the first evidence base to recover lost function in diabetes has already been known, and I'm pretty sure that some speakers will mention that. Now, about genetic engineering in vivo, when we thought it's a very distant future, but using CRISPR-Cas technologies, we can cure cirrhosis. And moreover, I can say that CRISPR-Cas, in all the minds of Nobel laureates, it's like number one, but not anymore. It's already number two because there are technologies on nickase enzyme, where everything happens much more selective and much more obvious. So that's really surprising time we're experiencing now. When we used to say that genetic treatment will change the gene sequencing, of course, yes. We consider it through the prism of genetic memory. And there is a whole niche of ATMP, so-called innovative treatment products in the world. And we have to say that's the biggest trend in biotechnologies. And this is a treatment that could completely transform the quality and life expectancy, including personification of treatment, the highest possible personification. And here I'm showing you the dynamics, how the state-based sector and private sectors are supported in this context here. And please appreciate here in gene treatment. So these are billions of US dollars in gene modified cells, cell treatment, tissue treatment. Well, in the time when we used to believe that each doctor would be biotechnologist and genetic engineer, well, I think it is already feasible. It is already feasible. Let's look at the clinical trials distributed in types of technologies in gene treatment. It's already industrial stage. It's not lab. It's not bench any longer. So that's already gene treatment. This is 2022. That's 465 for gene modified, cell treatment 422, and tissue treatment more than 180. So these are therapeutic areas. These are therapeutic areas, and I'm extremely happy that today we can share it in the Congress. This is ophthalmology, this is endocrinology, oncology, orthopedics, and immunological diseases, and also cardiovascular diseases. And please appreciate over here, I try to reflect in these perspective models the options for the new designs of medical treatment. So what platforms are available, what technologies are available. So if we used to believe, let's say the first group is a delivery of exogen autologous or allogenic cells, then the second one, it's purely genetic engineering approach and now biosampling. And on the crossroads, in the intersections of all three circles, we see something that could be rolled into one in the immune-engineered cell biomaterial therapy. Extremely strong combinations, and there is no very well position about that. I'm speaking about the specific antibodies. There is CAR-T available. And what is the best dynamic? The combination of both, but this data is not yet available. Or let's see how the immunotherapy could be combined with cell-based engineering. So these combinations also demonstrate fabulous results, or let's say encapsulated options with the destructive biomaterial like a carrier. Or we could see monoclonal antibodies plus cytokines. So such unusual combinations are the cutting edge. They're actively being studied, and believe me, there will be lots of findings. But please appreciate, even these ones cannot be forgotten here, cytokine-based or macrophage-based. So there are different schemes here. And in fact, cell therapy like B cells is also very important. And also there are disease-modifying treatments, DMT. So yesterday we had a very interesting meeting on cathepsin family in pulmonary oncology. Again, without diving deep, otherwise I will take too much time of the session. So these are pro-inflammatory cytokines where the antibodies could be designed against IL-1 and anti-TNF. Also MMPs, metalloproteinases, also regeneration of tissues. That is important. And later on, I will show you some specific things. Because when we take, for example, cartilage degeneration, so it's already the fourth generation for cartilage recovery. So this is tissue-based engineering. Why chondrocytes are developing best of all? Because that was the start as a minimally differentiated tissue. So all cell treatment started from that. Probably we also see very wide horizons for the use of non-modified mesenchymal stromal cells. They're pluripotent, they're easy to migrate, and they could work effectively in such powerful areas like neurology or orthopedics, dermatology, neurology. So it is all mentioned here. Now, therapeutical platforms based on gene cells, and this is what I'm going to talk a little bit about. And separately here, just in one slide. So this is mesenchymal stromal cells, chondrocytes, macrophages, fibroblasts, and T and B cells in very different but in very different strategies and in very different combinations. For example, if chondrocytes in the strategy of transduction, then mesenchymal stromal cells also in the strategy of lentiviral transduction. So then the data is more and more, and targeted strategies and personalized medicine are playing a key role here. These are key things we want to talk about. So definitely there are other approaches, and with our common efforts, we made lots of findings during COVID. But these are not just laboratory findings on the therapeutical effects or exosome. What is the advantage here? These technologies are easy. So I wouldn't say it's difficult, but they are easier than others to be described for the submission of the regulators to make it a therapeutical option that meets current legislation. So, and this is a very good example, closer to the final one. I'm showing it to you, the first clinical trial carried out in our country on autologous tissues and chondrocytes. It has been completed. Phase 3 is completed. And now we are saying that we are ready for the registration of the first cell-based products in the Federal Law 180 in the territory of Eurasian Economic Union. So this is Directive 78. So with dramatic damages of the knees up to 10 square centimeters of the cartilage, we are allowed now to replace with the scaled-up production of cartilage tissue within 4 weeks with mini approach. We take 70%, so where the total knee replacement was done. So now with mini approach, we take few grams of healthy cartilage, then in the isolator, we grow the mass of own cartilage, and then we re-inject it a month later as a chondrosphere. It looks like this. So I will try to show my video. This is endoscopy. And this is how the cartilage cells could be supplied, then adhesion to the damaged tissues. And very recently in Smolensk, just 2 weeks ago, we reported our main results. So it tells us that we already actually entered the era of the third generation treatments. So colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation to speak up today. I wish you take care, enjoy the conference, and have a good day. Thank you. Thank you very much. Dmitry, thank you very much. That was really a thrilling presentation showing us the counting ages. And our Congress, in fact, starts with innovations. And I believe this is a very good beginning, which is showing that all that information that we're going to discuss today would be of very innovative origin. Actually, in the plenary session a year ago, we had many questions, and I remember that. So there were questions about the risks, pulmonological risks, and they were directly related to the smoking and to the modern systems of tobacco deliveries or ICOS. So can these systems increase risks versus classical smoking, or if they are not increasing or reducing it, and how the prognosis of such patients could be changed? And we know very well that having these new systems of nicotine delivery, there is a dramatic increase of lipoid pneumonias, and nobody saw them in such amounts. And actually, it changed modern pulmonology dramatically. But my position is not the expert position. Definitely, in order to provide very comprehensive answer to this question about the modern system of tobacco delivery, and believe me, there are many questions and very many specialists are asking about it, and there are multiple discussions. So today we invited one of the leading experts in pulmonology. We invited Professor Aisanov, who is a professor and doctor of medical science and the lead of pulmonology chair. And we asked him to speak about this topic, the modern system of tobacco delivery, the position of pulmonologists. The microphone is yours. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear colleagues, dear Alexander. And first of all, I would like to thank for the kindest invitation to participate in the plenary session. And now, moving to the topic, I would like to tell you that with the availability of the electronic system of nicotine delivery, like IQOS and Juul, we faced new challenges. Why I'm saying about the challenges? Because on the one hand, we all clearly remember that in the mid of 1990s, we faced anti-tobacco smoking campaign, and actually it influenced dramatically the use of tobacco all over the world, and restrictive measures were introduced about tobacco smoking all over the world. But still, tobacco manufacturers and those who were interested in promoting this industry and these products, they actually changed. They changed themselves. They called these innovations for help, and these are innovative products, innovative ways of methods of tobacco delivery, and they wanted to reach new technological level for tobacco smoking. And here lots of things were used. So they used psychology. They used the psychology of the youngsters, because youngsters, they actually get new interest to gadgets. And this interest to gadgets also was prolonged with the use of tobacco. So this trend to use new technologies by the youngsters was very successfully used by this industry. So please appreciate all these devices that were introduced. They were using new ways of delivery. They actually used this particular trend, design, digitalized approaches. And one of the very recent technologies, and probably the most successful technology, which is dual technology, they actually use the fact that these devices were quite similar to USB stickers. So every youngster who started using it, he used to believe, or she used to believe, that they purchased a new gadget. And this is a very modern trend. Beside the fact that they used these factors of smoking. So there are very many different modifications, many technologies here, and well, there are differences here in the delivery, but the most important thing here that all these delivery systems, they are using non-traditional forms of nicotine, and this is the nicotine that has other properties that is different from standard tobacco. How actually it influenced the use of nicotine all over the world. So what was the public was concerned about? Well, in fact, youngsters started doing it very actively. So that's the data of prevalence that were published in JAMA, that's American Medical Association. So it shows us the data for the 12 and 12 years old. So you see that tobacco is exponentially growing from 2017 to 2020. We see these terrifying figures, but the most important, that these school children that start using it, they actually got into the dependence on nicotine, and they would never get rid of it. What happened in Russia? So this is not very new survey that was introduced and actually was done among 6,000 participants starting from 18 and older, 18 plus. So they were asked, what do you smoke currently? In 2019, so there was quite a small percentage of electronic cigarettes, just 1.3% versus 30%, almost 30% of cigarettes. And actually, so they were cigars and other options. But if you put it together, 2 plus 6 plus 1 plus 3, because electronic cigarettes and tobacco heating systems, so that's almost 4%. What happened next? So this is very recent data that were appreciated and were presented by the Union of Manufacturers of Nicotine-Containing Devices. So you see it's growing 50 times for the last 3 years, this use of electronic cigarettes or vapes. And here we appreciate terrifying figures, really terrifying figures, which are also shown in money and in the amount of electronic cigarettes which were sold. And this is the data that was published in 2021. What's the secret of popularity? Well, so people say that's modern trend of gadgets. But beside that, the youngsters, they have trends towards digital and innovative. There are other things that could be reported after the survey in 2019. Many people used to believe that the smoking of electronic cigarettes cannot be equalized to standard smoking. So 59% people believed that this is less harmful health no smell from clothes and fingers, but the question is what is more pleasant. And also it's easy to get rid of prohibitions and bans in the public spaces. So you could frequently see that in the places, if there is a prohibition for smoking, people were easily using electronic cigarettes, and that was a problem. But in fact, many considered electronic cigarettes as a way to stop smoking. So that was also supported by the companies that were actually promoting vaping or electronic systems of delivery of nicotine. So they cultivated the statement that this is a way to get rid of smoking, to stop smoking, to go for smoking cessation. So ICOS, one of the quite acute ordinary smoking, so that's the main topic in the establishing of the product. So that was also established by Philip Morris, and that was I quit classical smoking. And when they carried out the study, whether it is possible to use such products to stop smoking in reality, but small studies showed that from 100 of patients, only 4 of them could get rid of smoking, and 14 switched from standard cigarettes to electronic. 57% actually continued smoking, and 25 patients, 25%, because totally they were 100 included, so became so-called double smokers. So that means they started using vaping actively, but they couldn't get rid of electronic cigarettes. So this double smoking is of specific danger, because in this case, when they use both technologies, then patient has double risk. In continuation of the survey, we could appreciate the following data, and this is a publication of 2019. You can see that only 25% of participants believe that electronic cigarettes is a step towards smoking cessation. If there are limitations of free sales, then more than half of them, 54%, would never reject from them, although it would be inconvenient, and only 13% in response to limitations would try to get rid of tobacco and electronic cigarettes as well. We see how slowly and steadily these electronic systems are managing those who started them, and regardless the limitations, patients are not going to get rid of them, even with the inconvenience. Actually, I tackled the topic of double smoking. So this is the study which was published in 2021 in the Clinical Pharmacology magazine. So they showed here, so when they compared different technologies of nicotine delivery and when they analyzed what is the level of nicotine in plasma, so you can appreciate here, so when they use electronic cigarettes, all these patients were the ones that used very different technologies of tobacco deliveries. But when we see that they use the changed capacity of energy, so it gives highest concentration of nicotine. So that's a response to the question whether electronic device could reduce the concentration of nicotine. No, it cannot. And as a pulmonologist, I would specifically go to the lesions of the respiratory system, because lots of in the physiology here, and we should know which substances are in tobacco, and this is actually the answer to why electronic cigarettes and electronic smoking is even more dangerous than the classical smoking, because beside nicotine, this is tobacco specific nitrosamines. Also, there are aldehydes, propylene glycol, glycerin, and aromatic additives that actually provide additional influence to the respiratory tract. So, and besides the effects of tobacco that we see towards CNS, so electronic delivery system could easily overcome BBB, so there is a high level of systemic absorption, and this is perfect delivery system, because we can use inhalers for delivery of medicines. So we see damages at the level of bronchi and alveoli. Actually, the compartment which transmit the gases in the respiratory system. And we have particular theory in the depot of particles. Well, we inhale external particles, especially with tobacco, what matters here is a dispersity of the particles. So respiratory fraction, respirable fractions. So these are minor particles. They're most optimal. So something which is intrinsic for the modern tobacco delivery systems. So they can easily overcome this component impaction. And in this context, it's something which is inhaled and it stops in the upper compartment, but it never happens in the electronic system. So girls, they are prone to use this delivery system, but depot and diffusion to the particles which are inhaled. They're smaller size. That's why mainly periphery bronchi can be damaged, so-called minor fine bronchi and alveoli. And let me remind you, based on physiology, we know that fine respiratory waves are specifically important because here it's not a convection motion any longer with a physical flow that has particular speed of the flow, but this is diffusion-based exchange based on differences in concentration. So that means fine particles, they're more prone to that and they're easier to get into the respiratory alveoli and to the alveolar level. So we carry out studies that are telling about the effect of such particles to peripheral bronchi. So this is impulse oscillometry that could help us to measure how these particles could influence the conductivity of peripheral bronchi. And we know that this is a significant influence to the level of the main bronchi without influencing traditional parameters of spirometry. So what is very important here is that the particles like vitamin E and ketones, they influence the lungs and they influence important cell like macrophage. And macrophage, which is overloaded with aldehydes, is called foamy cells. And this provides a really very strong effect to the surfactant. Surfactant is something that influences elasticity in the lungs. Besides, there is a very strong influence to the immune system, and this influence to different cells plays a very big role because it influences the same physiology. Here in the infographics, you see the cross-cut of the alveoli. So normal lung is not damaged. You see elastic collagen fibers, which are free and tortuous, and the structure of the lung is not ruined. But if the tobacco delivery system is used, here are the changes that we see. So there is a rupture of these elastic fibers, which is shown here. Accumulation of inflammation cells that leads to the local inflammation in the cells and also to the systemic inflammation of the whole organism. And another important thing here, very important, and it also plays a role because the role of hyaluronic acid is now studied in all the tissues. It plays a very big role also in the tissues of lungs. Here we see with this effect of pathogen and tobacco, we see that hyaluronic acid could be damaged in lungs. It could be transformed into hyaluronic fragments, and then through so-called toll-like receptors and gene amyloid differentiation, it could lead to the lung damage. So these are all mechanisms, and what we see at the end are very, very different pulmonological manifestations. So it could be hypersensitive pneumonitis. This is organizing pneumonia, also diffuse alveolar damage, and also diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, pneumonias, lipoid pneumonias. So this is a spectrum of damages that could cause this so-called syndrome of using vaping that is used in different abbreviations like EVALI, VAPI, and VALI, which is vaping-associated pulmonary injury and vaping-associated lung injury. So this is very important. So this is a very big term that includes all this diversity of lung images. And this is something we saw in COVID, very similar to COVID. So here we see the same manifestations of fibrosis and also manifestations that refer to the ground glass capacities. So all that could be developed in vaping as well. So this is EVALI, so e-cigarette, actually had very serious bursts in the United States. So from 2019 to 2020, within a year, they saw the pandemic. So you see the dramatic growth of these damages in the United States that actually was created by vaping. And finally, FDA changed their position, and the device that actually was, it took 70% of the market, actually, it was prohibited by FDA in 2021. At the end of my presentation, unfortunately, I cannot speak more, so I want to give you this picture. This is a patient of 18 years old, and because of vaping, she got into ICU, and she's writing that this pneumonia is something that saved her life, because if there is no pneumonia, she would continue doing vaping, and she starts no vaping campaign. So wrapping up my presentation, I want to tell you that we faced a very serious challenge, extremely serious challenge that brings lots of dangers here. So beside the habit, it is also the use of the psychology of the youngsters. We don't know all the consequences yet of this very new phenomenon, because unlike standard classical smoking, we yet have no data that could help us follow this population for quite a time. But the studies are ongoing, and hopefully in the near future we'll get something that will help us to combat with these innovative delivery systems. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Aysanov. Very comprehensive presentation. I totally agree with you that this is very little time for such innovative presentation. And hopefully we managed to answer dozens and hundreds of questions that we have received on this type of delivery systems. And I cannot agree more. Yes, in the red zone, we several times saw patients with Everly syndrome, and we considered it as like COVID-19 because they performed CT and yet they were active vape users. We need to understand that such risks do exist, such studies should be carried out, and I do hope that by the next Congress we will be able to present even more innovative data about it, because there would be another year along. But we move on. And now I would like to raise another very important topic, and it is heart failure. And I spoke about it in my presentation. I'm not going to take too much of your time. I want to say now that heart failure is much more prevalent. You can object and you can tell me, how come COVID unfortunately killed lots of patients according to classification D or class 4 and 3 by the NIHA. So very many patients who even did not get COVID but still died because they tried to stick to the isolation, self-isolation. They didn't come to doctors, they didn't purchase treatments, and actually it happened. That was a reality, but COVID gave us a burst of new cases of heart failure de novo. And this is exactly the situation. This is exactly the burden for the cardiology and internal diseases that we have to work with. That's why experience sharing is very important objective for all of us. Eurasian Association has global plans about heart failure, and yet I'm not disclosing them. But first and foremost, I would like to give the microphone to Muhabat Sensizbaevna with the experience of managing heart failure in the territory of Kazakhstan, where they also faced with this challenge. Microphone is yours.
Презентацию об опыте республики нашей страны, Казахстан, в менеджменте пациентов с хронической сердечной
Let me start my presentation about Kazakhstan's situation and heart failure. Population by September this year is 19 million people. And according to the official data, we have about 16,000 hospitalizations a year. That's the need for heart failure patients. But as arterial hypertension and other diseases here are complicated with CHF, then yes, official statistics that is available now unfortunately does not clearly reflect the number of patients with CHF. And if we are guided by European data on the percentage of HF patients from the total population. So most probably in Kazakhstan, we should have about 350,000 patients with heart failure at different stages. So Kazakhstan takes position number 9 in the world in the territory. And as you can appreciate in this map, we have very big distances in between the regions, in between the large cities, where there is a good concentration of the medical services. Back in 2018, so the roadmap was initiated for chronic heart failure at the level of the healthcare ministry. This roadmap was later on continued for this and for the following years. In this framework, in this roadmap, we have two big sections, which is medical care for CHF patients and also human resource issue. According to this roadmap, we offered several ways for future directions to care about patients. First, using new technologies. Second, regional coordinators of CHF service. Third, organization of special information system on CHF. Fourth, consultations in the regions for the management of CHF patients. The analysis of healthcare organization, outpatient clinics, and hospital wards for patients with CHF specifically. And for human resource, for human capital, so the task is to train regional cardiologists and also GPs for the management of patients with CHF. Currently, Kazakhstan consists of 20 regions, 17 regional centers, and 3 federal level cities: Astana, Almaty, and Shymkent. In each region, we see responsible coordinators for CHF issues, and its accountability includes managing the register, the analysis of patient statistics, training by diagnosis and treatment with CHF patients, um, and also monitoring and follow-up of the patients, managing of patients after the surgical treatment, patient selection for surgical and interventional treatment, participation in master classes and seminars on CHF in the federal level centers, and also patient schools for CHF patients in the regions. In our clinic, we have dedicated CHF patient school, which carries out educational cycles for 1 week for the healthcare professionals from all regions, cardiologists and GPs, and we had dedicated cycle for nurses that are working specifically in the chronic heart failure in our clinic and in the regions. In this school, we provide the baseline knowledge about chronic heart failure, including the indications for surgeries, patient selection indications, and contraindications for ICT CRTD, and also treatment of patients with acute decompensation in ICU units. According to the objectives of the roadmap, in the chronic heart failure, we scheduled the opening of regional CHF offices currently. We experience 116 regional CHF offices all around Kazakhstan in all the regions, and as a result, we don't simply identify patients and follow them, but also we actively identify new patients. So monthly, we carry out online consultations with our regional coordinators on chronic heart failure. We discussed all our issues and challenges we see in the regions, and also we carry out CHF schools online. One of important directions for the work of our team in CHF is the design of the guidelines and clinical protocols for CHF management and methodological brochures for colleagues in the regions. This year, we made an upgrade of clinical protocol, keeping in mind new European and American guidelines of 2021 and 2022 for CHF management, and also methodological guides for chronic heart failure that should be the pocketbook for our colleagues in the regions. We designed a registry for chronic heart failure that currently is being implemented as a pilot project in the regions. So register is simple, and already today we could try to register all patients with CHF in different stages. When we launched our CHF program, we managed also to launch the outpatient center for CHF, and we had appointments for all the patients and patients who are registered for the follow-up patients after the implantations and heart transplantation. And in our clinic, since the launch, we have a dedicated program of the terminal stage management, which is a heart transplantation, and also MCS program. MCS program was initiated back in 2011, and that's the specificity of our clinic, the program of surgical treatment of terminal stage of heart failure, because we first initiated MCS and only 1 year later we performed the first cardiac transplantation to patients with terminal heart failure. In 2013, heart transplantation was carried out with the support of OCS Transmedics. In 2014, our clinic was included into the international MARC trial for using HM3CL. This is mechanical support of circulation. In 2015 and later on in 2017, we were included into the trial on using OCS for lung, CARMAT, TAH in terminal heart failure, and in 2018 in our clinic we performed the first cardiac transplantation after CARMAT, and also in December we performed first in the world EUAT Levifus Cardio plus Jarvik 2000. And then in 2020, our clinic was included into the ARIAS international study to use anticoagulant and disaggregant treatment in patients after the implantation. As I said before, on August 8, 2012, we performed first cardiac transplantation in Kazakhstan with the support of our colleagues from Spain. So here you see some cardiosurgeons and surgical team working in the OR. And that was the first cardiac transplantation in the country. So by now, we completed 85 cardiac transplantations. Why only 85? Because definitely the need is much higher. So total cardiac transplantation without left ventricular assisted device, 45 cases, and after LVAD, even more. As I said, in 2013, we started using organ care system Transmedics, or CST, and actually 59 patients were already transplanted. So this is a case of 16 preservation and transplantation of donor heart before the transplantation to the recipient. So this is Transmedics system. So this is a really unique case, and currently Kazakhstan takes the 9th position in the world in the territory. That's why the use of organ care system Transmedics is a very important step for development of the transplantation programs in our country. So we had to deliver this heart using Transmedics machine, and patient was discharged 2 weeks after the transplantation, and currently patient is alive and stable. As I said before, the need of cardiac transplantation is much higher than what we do. So for So 10 transplantations per 1 million population. So normally this is about 190 transplantations per year. So currently we have 121 patients in the waiting list. So the average age is about 44, pretty young patients, 93 males and 28 females. So the average waiting time for the donor is almost 4 years, and definitely 70% have left ventricular assisted device LVAD. And actually, annually, 30 patients die from the waiting list. That is why we have active development of using MCS and different approaches for the clinical support of circulation. So we started using TAC and BVAD. So we implanted totally 467 devices with different modifications, and currently 195 patients are supported by LVAD. MCS as a bridge to transplantation. As I said, we performed it for 40 cases and 84 more are in the waiting list. So that means total number of patients that were potential candidates here for transplantation is 124 patients. Here you see that the most successful in the cardiac transplantation were 2015, 2016, 2017, when we performed the highest rate of transplantation. And at that year, you see the changes of implantations rate. But unfortunately, 2021, 22, due to pandemic, our transplantation rate was reduced. We performed just 3 cardiac transplantations here. And together with the government of the country, we're discussing the issue to establish dedicated donor program just for cardiac transplantation. So, as I said before, in 2018, we were included into the trial for complete artificial heart, which is CARMAT. 3 implantations were performed, and all 3 patients later on, in 4, 6, and 8 months, the true heart was reimplanted. And in December 2018, we performed first and the only in the world full implantable VAD transplantation, so-called VVAD. So that's infectious cardiomyopathy. So 3 months later, the cardiac transplantation was re-performed, and we do hope that this type of surgery will give a chance to preserve lives to more patients with terminal stage of heart failure that need cardiac transplantation. And full implantable VAD, VVAD, would give a great chance of life expectancy and prolongation of life to such patients. We believe that it is very important to work with heart failure, and it should be known not only by those patients who need our help and who need our care. I think it should be public awareness, and we carry out lots of meetings with the parliament of the country, with the government of the country, with public organizations, and it gives us opportunity to develop this program very actively in Kazakhstan for the patients with severe heart failure. And we do hope that these programs would give opportunities to improve both the quality of life and also to increase the life expectancy. Thank you very much for your attention. Mahabat, thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. And I believe your experience is extremely valuable, and possibly later on it can be used and can be implemented in the medical organizations of any countries. I would like to say that heart failure later on would be actively discussed in the Congress. We will discuss the issue of management, medical conservative management, I would say maintenance in the specialized CHF patients, chronic patients that due to some reason is not a candidate for surgery. But that would be a fast-track session, which we scheduled for tomorrow. But today, in the plenary session, now I'm happy to give the floor to the next speaker, and this is Professor Nikitin, and he will speak about one more important topic. This is chronic viral hepatitis B and available methods of treatment which are available. And we see particular changes here. I'm pretty sure that Igor will speak more about it? Well, we know that hepatitis C is successfully treated for years, but hepatitis B is not 100% effective treatment, and it is associated with particular complications. Microphone is yours. Colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And now I see my presentation is moving. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak up today. So it's my honor and pleasure, and I was pleased by the presentation. Especially, I like Kazakhstan presentation because I was born in Kazakhstan many years ago, and many thanks for all these things to Muhammad. And I wonder to know more what's the situation with hepatitis B and generally in the development of the healthcare. And I would like to wish them all the best and future success. The topic of my presentation today is chronic viral hep B, available options of treatments. Alexander Grigorievich already mentioned a very important thing when he was speaking about the perspectives and approaches for the treatment of chronic viral hepatitis B. Well, recent achievements of clinical pharmacology and molecular biology allowed us to cure the only chronic viral disease, and this is viral hep C. But for the viral hep B, the situation is different. It is not so obvious. Why, actually? And I will try to cover that issue in my short presentation. Speaking about the burden, medical and social burden of the chronic viral hepatitis, and this is the data for 2020 shown here. So we see about 300 million people who suffer from this disease. So that's very intensive color shown here. So we're not talking about Australia, but China. China, a global supplier of the primary hepatocellular carcinoma, HCC, hepatocellular carcinoma, which is associated with liver cirrhosis. So that's highest prevalence of HBs antigen shown here. That means chronic infection of hepatitis B in this country. And 20 years ago, the leadership of the China Communist Party set a very ambitious task to create the layer of absolutely healthy population, healthy from viral hepatitis B. They wanted to intensify the program of vaccination. We have to say that Russian Federation is taking one of the leading positions in such issue like first vaccine carried out for the newborns in the maternity house from viral hepatitis B. So my grandson was born October 6th and he was vaccinated against hepatitis B. Well, the prevalence is high, especially in some regions, Pacific region, African, and some European regions, specifically Turkey. And now they see highest rate of hepatitis B due to lots of migrants who are coming to that continent. Life cycle of viral hepatitis B is very well known. Some people believe that Hep B virus is like a space mind arrived from somewhere. Just imagine how it looks like. This is a product of natural evolution. Sometimes it's even difficult to imagine it because life cycle of viral hepatitis B is split into stages like internalization to the cell through the HNTCP receptor, then integration into the nucleus of the cell, unlike other viruses, by the way. And here we appreciate the formation of complementary RNA, then transcription, translation, then reverse transcription, and finally synthesis of positive DNA chain. And then through the system of endoplasmatic reticulum, we see the complete assembly of the virus and then release through the cell, secretion out of the cell also. So-called viral-like proteins are secreted from the cells, so that's assembly products, but they did not reach the maturity of the whole virion. Actually, immunity is control via several chains, and two most important of them. This is congenital immunity and innate immunity, which is working against the viral internalization and particular expression of antigens. But the mechanism of cell injury, specifically hepatocytes, because viral hepatitis B could be assembled not only in liver cells, but in other organs and tissues and target cells. So we know this complex reaction, for example, classic complex of periodontitis with HBs antigen. So it's like a separate, quite malignant form that cannot be treated without antiviral options. So defects in these two pieces of chain of immunity, innate immunity, congenital, and adaptive immunity, all that leads to the formation of chronic infection in children. A virus of hepatitis B is becoming chronic in 60 to 80% of cases, but in adults, this percentage is opposite, 20-25. And the more severe is the manifestation of the acute hepatitis B, the lower the probability of chronic process later on. Why chronic viral hepatitis B is dangerous? Please appreciate here, this is H-NTCP receptor for the binding of another terrible viral hepatitis, which we cannot treat. We can manage it only, which is viral hepatitis delta, that can exist only where HBs antigen is available. That is why the prevention of chronic viral hepatitis B and acute viral hepatitis B also protects from viral hepatitis delta. So that's complicated mechanism of viral internalization. How should we interpret laboratory data that we get after the examination checkup of the patients? So there are many patients. They get into the general wards, gynecological wards, surgical wards, etc. But if we identify S antigen, superficial antigen, that's for sure viremia. So that's absolutely clear the presence of infection in organism. S antigen could be absent in occult HBV infection, which means the mutation in S domain. HBe antigen, so E antigen is an antigen that has very special clinical picture of the disease. So this is so-called Asian version. So I follow one lady, a colleague of ours, and long ago she moved from southern Kazakhstan. So we treat and treat and treat her, but HB antigen is still there. It is still there, and we don't get seroconversion for this antigen. So, but if this is not treated option where you see antigen E, so there is a very high probability of cirrhosis than HCC carcinoma, and it is all associated with a very high viral load. Well, but to our great happiness in our region, let's say European part of the Russian Federation, we face mainly anti-HB antigen negative option, where the virus already experienced the pressing of immune system, and this is, let's say, more or less improved version of the disease, well, if we can call it, versus HB positive option. Anti-HB core antigen, so these are antibodies that are found in the recent infection, not later than 6 months. Anti-HBs, that's what we're always waiting for, either after the infection, let's say acute infection, or let's say after treatment. Yes, such fantastic things may happen, but very rarely, or after the vaccination, we can measure the titer of anti-HBs. So that's our golden objective that we want to get. So when HBV faces microorganism, this is the titer of antibodies to S antigen. So that tells us about the immunity rate of organism, and anti-HB core IgG. And I want to pay special attention to that. So that fact that microorganism meets HBV. So there are patients, no E antigen, no S antigen, no antibodies, but there is only isolated anti-HB core IgG. So formally, we need to consider this group is a patient, so with a risk group. and we can expect reaction here. In 12 blood donors, there were such publications previously. They had products of blood, platelet concentrate, washout erythrocytes, and also plasma with isolated anti-HB core IgG, and then after the transfusion, 8 recipients gave acute viral hepatitis B. So most probably, this is the version of chronic HBV infection. Now, the potential significance of HBS monitoring, extremely important, because if charges are low and if we have normal level of ALT but HBS antigen is positive, then we consider it as a relatively benign cause of the infection, and we just follow the patient. We measure ALT, and sometimes we take even puncture biopsy. So we should identify the moment of start of treatment. Hepatitis C treatment is very simple puzzle. You put pieces and then you follow the guide. But the treatment of chronic viral hepatitis B, that's another story, completely different story. You should identify very clearly on when to start the treatment. Why it is important? Because in fact, the treatment of HBV, it's like HIV infection. This is lifelong treatment, lifelong treatment. And by the way, currently, chronic HBV treatment is guided by OMS, which is the baseline reimbursement, and particular clinical statistical groups, keeping in mind that the disease has beginning and end. But in fact, this disease had just the beginning with no end. And from that, the federal regulators should change the financial reimbursement and specific financial mechanism to cover these patients, because this is in fact lifelong treatment. Also, there is antigen as well, and we need to monitor when we start treatment with pegylated interferons. Yes, this option is still available among patients with chronic viral hepatitis, and specifically hepatitis B and antigen positive, where we use interferons, pegylated interferons. And in that option, speaking about the prognosis and results of treatment, it is very important to have quantitative measurement of HBs antigen. So there are new serological markers of HBV infection. So this is HB core R antigen that includes fragments of E antigen and core antigen, so-called core-dependent protein or P22 core, which is identified in the same viral-like particles which are secreted not as a full-fledged virus but still secreted from cell. It could reflect this level of protein, that spiral DNA that is integrated into the cell nucleus. So this is nuclear reactor of ccctDNA. So in which conditions it could be very stretched and get into the replication cycle? Nobody knows. But still we know that this is immunosuppressive treatment, chemotherapy, stress, some comorbidities, other infections. And another marker, we know that HBV3NA, this is DNA virus, but you probably remember when we looked at the replication slide, we used to say that RNA chain for the translation can copy this virus. So there is another option here. We can measure this marker, HBV RNA, that also reflects the level of cccDNA, but in fact, these new methods and new serological markers, they are not yet properly standardized. So what's the modern treatment of chronic HBV? Well, we already said that the task for us is to identify the place and preferably the time. We need three things. We need to identify antigen status, whether it's antigen positive or antigen negative. That's why we need to measure viral load. We need to look at ALT level. and preferably it's to do the liver biopsy. Why I'm speaking specifically about biopsy? Because fibrosis index is good. It's good. It's universal index in any liver damage because there are serological tests and also there is reflected ultrasound signal. There is the MRI, but in hepatitis B, what is the most important is still the intensity of histological damage. That means the amount of necrosis and peripheral lymph infiltration, and only puncture biopsy could give us this result. That's why these parameters, they are actually the most important and they are the key ones for making decision where we start treatment or not. And besides, these studies should be done twice. So whether there is a first manifestation, if it was not done before, let's say, and this is the novel patient coming to the visit, then it is preferable to make a decision about the repetition of the tests and then identify with the beginning of treatment. And the key thing here, key issue here in the decision making is the level of HBV DNA. What are the main ideas for treatment? This is first of all histological improvement, because through the index of histological activity high, which is histology activity index, we see the level of the rate of um, dysplasia than liver cancer. This is suppression of HBV DNA up to undetectable level, like in HIV. This is normalization of ALT, and our most important objective in antigen positive HBV is anti-HBE. So that means a switch to less malignant stage of the disease to more benign. And the objective here, super priority objective, which is rarely obtained. This is the loss of S antigen. It would be great if they would be antibodies to S antigen. Approaches to treatments of chronic hepatitis B in cirrhosis-free patients. Well, this is detection of ILT and also the level of viral load. And in antigen-positive patients, you see what figures we used to have before. 20,000, then 2,000. That was a recent change of 2017. Then American Association also updated their algorithm, and very final is shown on the right in e-agent negative option. So that's 2,000 copies or higher. This is the indication to start antiviral treatment. And let me remind you about the normal ranges of ALT and AST in males and females. And there are such approaches, specifically American Association of Gastroenterologists and Hepatologists, where ALT levels are artificially reduced in order to have more selective choice of the patients, to select them with more precision. So also some add-ons were recently made, and they're interesting from the point of organization of treatment. And this is American Association to Study Liver Diseases. These are guidelines of AASLD for the group of patients where the ALT is intermediate. So the decision was made depending on the results of biopsy or non-invasive tests. But again, the biopsy here is the leading one. So there is a group of patients where ALT is almost normal or subnormal. But when you perform puncture biopsy, you are getting to panic because there is very clear manifestation of histological activity. What is very important here is a family history of HCC, hepatocellular carcinoma, because if in the medical history or in the relatives first, second line, so there was a case of HCC, hepatocellular carcinoma, so this criteria about the start of antiviral treatment are becoming more stringent. So if patient already had cirrhosis but compensated or even decompensated cirrhosis, regardless the level of ALT, then antiviral treatment should be administered. And finally, immunotolerant tests older than 40, and this is a normal level of ALT measured twice, and for them, antiviral treatment is also indicated. So preferable treatment, first line in patients with chronic viral hepatitis B. So today we have two options available, which is entecavir or tenofovir alafenamide in patients with renal dysfunction and osteoporosis, depending on cirrhosis status. But in reality, we have to use only one option, which is tenofovir desoproxil fumarate, which is 300 milligram, and sort of analog, let's say safer analog of tenofovir, which is tenofovir alafenamide, where the dose is 10 times less. It provides less effect towards osteoporosis, unlike tenofovir desoproxil fumarate, and less effect on renal dysfunction. If we talk about decompensated cirrhosis, then the drug of choice here is entecavir, and from tenofovirs, only the zoproxil fumarate. If we speak about E antigen positive, then pegylated interferon in patients with decompensated cirrhosis of liver is contraindicated. So how these drugs are working? So here are main mechanisms. So pegylated interferons, E antigen and positive, they have immunomodulatory effects, and they affect mainly adaptive immunity, but entecavir, tenofovir, and tenofovir desoproxil fumarate, nucleoside analogs, which are working as classical inhibitors of reverse transcriptase. And by the way, they're quite effective towards reverse transcriptase of HIV. So it's very reasonable to include them into the co-infection treatment, where we have co-infection of HIV and viral hepatitis B. So this is one interesting study which actually started switch of the patients to tenofovir desoproxil fumarate, which is more available, let's say, and much cheaper also on tenofovir alafate. So there is company, American company, very famous American company, and so this is Gilead Science, yes, and actually they specialize in antiviral low molecular treatments for the treatment of COVID-19. So they're designing options and also for hepatitis C and B. And they initiated very interesting study for tenofovir desoproxil fumarate as less safe option with a high adverse event rate. And we reached undetectable level there of HPV DNA, and then switched to tenofovir alafenamide, which is the 10 times less dose. So that was very good maintenance effect. Then patient continued to be undetectable for DNA, etc., etc. So the drug demonstrated dramatic advantages here. Um, Entecavir for renal dysfunction, and the dose of tenofovir alafenamide is very stable. 25 milligram in patients with GFR, less than 50 milliliters per minute. When we can stop the treatment, what do modern guidelines tell us about? So for cirrhosis, this is for sure a lifelong treatment, and there is no discussion here. If it was HBe antigen positive option, we are trying to reach antigen seroconversion, and also 12 months longer we continue consolidated treatment. Later on, we can stop it, but in 6 months, the patient should get to the doctor for the re-examination. So approximately in 35-40%, we see relapses. We still see the relapse of infection, and this is increased level of HBV DNA and the level of ALT. HB negative option. This is a lifelong treatment with the control of every 6 months. But nevertheless, approximately in 5%, well, this is not big, this is not large for general statistics, just 5% S antigen disappears for 5 years of treatment. This is done in study. This is disappearance of HBs antigen in the process of entecavir tenofovir treatment, but after the discontinuation for HBs negative viral hepatitis B, then the loss of S antigen, not in many patients, but could be reported. I told you that's about 5%. But this trend is increasing, and the predictor of that very rare phenomenon, very rare but very needed phenomenon, is a persisting low level of S antigen by the moment of discontinuation of treatment and 30 days after that. That's a separate story for the treatment of Hep B in pregnant. So, because I'm the consultant of multiple maternity houses and as a practitioner, I face almost daily with this challenge. What is more preferable is tenofovir. In the market, we have also the other nucleoside analogs, terbibudin, lamivudin, but this is only an alternative option. And tenofovir should be started in the pregnant female in the third trimester of pregnancy. In the third trimester of pregnancy, the discontinuation in 3 months is possible after the birth if initially HBV DNA level was not high, and then vaccination. So that's a classical vaccination, which is done once, then in 6, and then in 3 after the first one. The patient should be examined for the absence of markers of HBV infection, because if there are any, so it's useless to do the vaccine, and that's the scheme which is used all over the world. So another recombinant monoantigen vaccine was approved, which is done not 3 times but 2 times. So this is neoadjuvant GCPG, and it is approved for the adults older than 25, and it can be used as well as a more advanced option. So any marker, S antigen, and isolated anti-HB core antibodies, they mean that we should administer antiviral treatment. And now, in very many monoclonal antibodies, and the first label was in rituximab, and it was very clearly mentioned there that isolated management and anti-HB force means antiviral treatment before the start of rituximab. So we should remember that then, if there is immunosuppressive treatment, which is finished, then for the next 6-12 months of consolidated treatment. So unfortunately, there are multiple barriers for the complete elimination of HBV infection, and all that is guided by the life cycle. And so main objective of treatment, all main objective of treatment. So what we are doing around, why we are rolling around, we should select the time to start treatment, to monitor the treatment. This is something which is mentioned as a yellow dotted line here. So minimal S antigen negative DNA. So switch your E antigen to antibodies, and if possible, of course, and if this is a permit from the God, speaking statistical language, possibly we will get seroconversion on S antigen, and this is the best possible result for the treatment of HBV. Now, innovations and new approaches. Well, that's the topic of a separate presentation. So, because there are lots of new designs and ideas, which are being studied currently, but yet the results are quite negative. And today, once again, I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to speak up today and to make the conclusion in the light of the mentioned above. Chronic viral hepatitis B, it's a chronic viral disease which of complicated pathogenetic mechanism. The time to start the treatment and duration of treatment are guided by multiple factors. Viral factors, patient factors, presence or absence of cirrhosis, the rate of compensation, family medical history of HCC and presence of renal pathology. Actually, CKD would be actively discussed today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. Chronic viral hepatitis B required long-term and frequently lifelong treatment that provides proper control over the disease and minimization of risks for the development of complications like cirrhosis and HCC. We need to remember about the most reliable and essential tool to prevent this disease, which is a vaccination. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for brilliant presentation. And I think the Presidium of Association clearly understands the problem of hepatitis B, and we need to talk more and more about it because there are few patients like this, and this is a myth that we can do nothing. Well, we cannot cure it. It's more miracle than a fact, but still to treat these patients, to reduce their risks, this is exactly what you said in your wrapping up slide. That's a major task. We need to try to reach that. These are patients. They should be referred to the virologists. And also, I was very much impressed by your presentation. Don't wait for the miracle. Start to treat these patients as early as possible. So we are moving on, and now it's high time to get to a big presentation. So these are new paradigms in risk factors control in our patients, and it's my pleasure to give the floor to the correspondent member of Russian Academy of Sciences, Professor Arutyunov. Well, thank you very much. Let me draw your attention to the risk factors, because these assessments of risk factors were dramatically changed in the very near past. First of all, we formulated our understanding of risk factors when we carried out a gigantic study, 27 years of follow-up, 84 risk factors and different combinations that included metabolic, behavioral, psychological risk factors, 195 countries. What we found out? So that's a huge position of systolic arterial hypertension, and this is in the lethal outcomes and disability rate. High rates of blood glucose. Well, unexpected factor, so low body weight of newborns, new birth weights, and actually not much news here, but suddenly we find out that for recent years we observed quality changes. If in 1990, just listen to that, we had 4 out of 5 risk factors were behavioral, but in 2017, 3 out of 5 risk factors are metabolic factors. Metabolic factors. We just listen to a key change. So the first position here is obesity, then diabetes, then changed level of glucose, dyslipidemia in our patients. So the second figure that also thrills the imagination, 61% of mortality risks are non-controllable. 48% of disabilities are risk factors which are not properly controlled. This is how we formulated justification for the lifelong treatment in our patients and combating risk factors. Now, for the first time in the study, the data allow us to say that pandemia of overweight, for the first time in the modern story, is bigger than the patients who are underweight. Let's think about it. That's some different study, and this is a study which was carried out for 52 years, and they followed the rate of MIs and stroke and vascular events, depending controlling of the risk factors. So that's the conglomerate of three factors control: overweight, glucose, and dyslipidemia. Only three parameters minimized twice the risks and actually reduced the risks for the strokes. And this is a very important and interesting story. But the most important, for the first time, we just pronounced BMI. BMI, that's the simplest approach. Let's dive deep into that. So, it's easy to see. Let's appreciate left part of the slide. This red arrow is showing the patients who used to have overweight or increased body mass, but the other one are obesity. If patient has obesity more than one, the risk of his or her vascular catastrophe, specifically MI, increases by 81%. But if the patient is overweight, then the risk is increased by 32%. And we're absolutely right to say when we see the patient who are overweight, we immediately do the vector because we understand what it leads to. But now, there is a study, very interesting prospective study, where we compared BMI and visceral obesity. So, and here we see the results of what we had. So we looked at computer tomography, we looked at visceral fat. So here we see three red arrows that, depending on how the visceral obesity looks like here, and what we see here, it's regardless of the BMI, visceral obesity is the strongest risk factor because of calcium in coronary arteries and vascular catastrophes. Let's look at interesting combination, males and females with normal BMI, but we measured waist circumference and we saw a very strong visceral obesity. In case of normal BMI, so that's bigger, waist increases the risks of all-cause mortality and vascular mortality for males and for females. So let me emphasize once again, with a normal BMI, so the risks of vascular catastrophes is increased by 87%. In females, almost 50%. What's the point? What's the point for the practitioners to know this information? So you look at the patient, just think, is it an apple syndrome, bigger waist versus hips? And if it's a bigger waist than the hip, so that's morbid obesity. So just report this genotype. That's pretty severe prognosis of life and scenario of life. So very high rate of atherosclerosis. So that's what we are talking about, these patients. And we get the confirmation, nice study, which is called Million Females. And this is the data published for 500,000 of such females. So if BMI less than 25 and waist circumference less than 70, then vascular pathology would be developed in 1 out of 14. But if this is BMI more than 30 and waist circumference more than 80, so it's 1 out of 8. And I think there is no need to prove anything else. So that's one of the very strong risk factors, visceral obesity. Why visceral obesity is so loud in the modern world? So where the fat is localized here. So we saw the big waist in the patients. We should recollect the fat is along magistral vessels. Just remember how they take away the fat from aorta. So that's a unique fat. It potentiates the systemic inflammation. Fat is a 3D model. So the fat is around myocardium. So between myocardium and pericardium. So this is direct toxic effect. This is blockade of microcirculation. So the fat is under the capsule. So just remember how they try to cut the kidney, and this is very difficult to do because to cut the capsule is very difficult to do, and fat presses the kidney and activates RAS system, and ruins venous outflow. This is how visceral fat provides triple effect, as a minimum triple effect, on the scenario of life of our patient. So this is just an explanation in one of the leading risk factors. So that's the biggest innovation here. So just listen to the title of this innovation, cumulative time of low density lipoproteins. What does it give to our life? Let's start from the following. At the moment of birth, each of us has LDL level from 40 to 60. 40 to 60. Divide by 40, that's approximately 1.2, 1.3 milligram per deciliter. By the age of 2, we reach level of 70. By age of 11, 110, 120 milligram per deciliter. Just look at thinking of experts. They say that this level works for quite a number of years. So we found out that at the age of 40, the probability of MI in American population is 1%. And the level of LDL without statin treatment is 125 milligram per deciliter. So it was offered to multiply two parameters, 125 milligram per deciliter. They were working for 40 years, and finally we got a number of plaques. With this number of plaques, the probability of destabilization and MI is just 1%. We then get 5,000 milligram. What's innovation? So from the words totally good for population, we get to one specific patient, to your kids, to your grandkids. Just think it over, what you heard now. So 5,000 milligram years, so that's 1% of MI. Let's appreciate these curves here at the bottom, green arrow. So let's imagine the patient is at the level of 2 years old, 70, 80, lifelong. Then 5,000 milligram years was reached at the age of 62. But when the MI is unavoidable, 4% would never reached by him. So that means patient live MI free, MI free. And look at where you are at this slide. Let's look at the blue line, the central line. So if it's 125 milligram, that means 5,000 milligram years you would reach at the age of 40, and 4%, unfortunately, at the age of 62. So MI becomes the reality of your life. So the point of innovation here is the personalized approach, personalized care, personalized risk assessment in our patients, not a general in the population, but specifically in one specific patient. Let me repeat it once again, in one specific patient. So let's try to think it over. So we offer to reduce risks due to the LDL reduction, but let's think it over. Is it really safe? Is it really effective? Here on the left, we see 33 clinical situations. So starting from different GFR, different age group, different level of systolic blood pressure, weight of patients, diabetes, etc., etc. 33 clinical situations. So all geometric figures, they're moving to the left. So reduction less than 1 millimole reduces by 22% the risks at any age, in any clinical situation. There was a special question, what to do with patients who today are perceived by us as absolutely healthy, that has less than 2 millimole per liter. So that's upper curve showing here, red line. Even in such patients, if you reduce here by 1 millimole, then you additionally reduce the risks. And as a reduction of 1 millimole, it could lead to 15% reduction of main vascular catastrophes, 13% reduction of the risk of MI and stroke, and 16% reduction of stroke risk. The other big innovation for the recent years is the implementation into our practice the new calculated parameter. This is non-LDL cholesterol. You find the line of general cholesterol, total cholesterol, and HDL, and you do simple mathematics. From the total one, you deduce HDL, and that's how you get it. Non-HDL lipoprotein. Why is it needed? So this is a pool of particles that are responsible for atherosclerosis. Where can this parameter be used? Well, first, we proved the statistical power. So they compared the patients for 8 years, 13,000 patients, Copenhagen study. So they compared the effect, the prognosis in the non-HDL cholesterol, and they found out that non-HDL cholesterol appeared to be extremely effective, much more effective than HDL cholesterol. And this is how we are getting into the world. And finally, we see that estimated parameter is becoming more and more important. And this is prognosis of life of our patients. Where this parameter is implemented now, this is a scale which is called score 2. It's different from score 1 because it calculates not the risk of 10-year-old mortality, but risk of all the vascular catastrophes and plus risk of mortality. And here in the denominator, it's not a total cholesterol. I am showing it now, but this is non-HDL cholesterol in the denominator. What do we need to know here? Please appreciate sector D. Russia belongs to sector D, high rate of vascular mortalities per 100,000 population, so more than 300 per 100,000. So this scale allows us to assess the risks up to 90 years old, 90. Unfortunately, what we see here are just red lines. Should be stopped by that? Well, the risks are high, but in fact, it tells us about something else. If you see the patient less than 50, where the risk is from 2.5 up to 7.5, so almost in all of them, among non-smokers, females, then you should start a very big work to reduce the risks of mortality, risks of vascular catastrophes. And this is the biggest innovation in the modern world. Then the third factor that we talked about is hypodynamia. Follow my line. Number of steps, less than 3,500. But here is number of steps is more, much more than 10,000. So here you see how the risks of vascular events could be reduced. This is large meta-analysis which tells you if you walk 3,500 of steps, you reduce your risks, but minimally. But if you increase by 1,000 within a day, that it gives in different population from 6 to 36% of risk reduction of mortality. Now we have new term, and cardiologists, they should know that. This is a term of energy loss and physical activity. It's called PAIA. You can see it very frequently in the model literature, so you can easily calculate when we reach the best results. When we spend approximately 40 kilojoule per 1 kilo of weight, 40 kilojoule, it's 9.5 kilocalories. So you take and you multiply, and then you should burn 764 kilocalories to be on the safe side. So you can weigh devices, you should count the steps. And what do we need to do in order to burn 20? So before that, it could be 35 minutes and 2 minutes to walk faster. If you burn 30, then you reduce the risks twice versus the one who is mainly a sedentary lifestyle and burns 15 kilocalories per kilo of weight. That's why you should fight hypodynamia from the general message, walk more. Now is more specific calculation of number of steps during the day and more specific calculation of burned energy per kilo of waste. And the third innovation, very important, this is modificators. So one of the strongest modificators is a depression. So they compare two populations. So that's lonely, critical life events, and the other one dedicated, lively active. So they are totally different in the outcomes of the diseases after ACS. Please appreciate green line here. It tells us you carry out a screening after acute coronary syndrome depression. So then you treat depression. That's another green line. And screening with no treatment of depression, and this is a red one. For depressive patients, mortality risk is high. Depression is a very strong modificator of risk. The second is the level of education. Please appreciate left part here. The higher is the level of education, the lower are the risks. So the less is the contribution of other risk factors, and it could be higher. Now, some clarifications. Today we heard brilliant presentation on smoking and COPD. And actually, what we said in the recent studies, the most frightening here is the interval 30 days after discharge of the patient. And actually, it's almost tripling the probability of vascular catastrophe. Modifier and systemic inflammation. Is it perceived as a modifier? Yes, it has been proven for the rheumatoid arthritis patients. Patients with rheumatoid arthritis, just listen to that, they have the same risk of MI and vascular catastrophes like in general population, which is 10 years older. So that means these patients are 10 years older than their passport age. So that's the systemic inflammation. New modifier, migraine. It's a feature of severe vascular catastrophes in females. Another one, which is a prolongation of sleep. Sleep 7 hours, if it's 1 hour longer or 1 hour shorter, increases the risks of mortalities. But the sleep 1 hour longer increases the risks of MI, strokes, etc. Risks of strokes, they're increasing by 18%. But if you reduce it 1 hour, just 6%, then the difference is very strong. Let's get used to new interpretation of such modifier, corrective dysfunction, erectile dysfunction. That's actually showing a very short interval, in average 3 years, of the manifestation of peripheral artery disease and coronary and vascular brain catastrophes. Passive smoking. Well, we know that, and it was just shown in the presentation, but let me draw your attention to the following.
Модификатор сосудистых рисков, 18% усиления всех существующих рисков и внимание к последней строке.
So please some attention to the last line. Tobacco for smoking and snus increased by 30% of negative effect of all known risk factors. Salt as a risk factor. Now the interpretation and patient management changed. So these are not just words. So 25% now moves to sodium chlorate to potassium chlorate, but it reduces the risks of strokes by 16%. Now, coffee is a risk factor. Yes, coffee is considered to be a risk factor if this is not filtered coffee. This is Turkish and Greek coffee if patient gets more than 4 cups a day, but 3-4 cups, according to the exposition, does not provide any influence. So wrapping up my presentation, I would like to say the following. As a risk factor, malnutrition or wrong nutrition is an independent risk factor. Salt reduction, saturated fat reduction. Now we have clear understanding that the control of nutrition is very important. It could reduce MI risk by 37%. That's very strong, very powerful risk factor we should count. And today we have more specific recommendations about the fat red meat, about sugar and sugar-containing beverages. We should reduce them. And there is a third recommendation, which is 30-45 grams of fiber. And you increase the dose slowly because it changes microbiota for the better and then reduces the strength of manifestation of cardiovascular risk factors. Now let's look at the final slide. 200 grams fruit a day, 200 grams of vegetables a day. So this is something that reduces your risks. Reduce red meat due to the increase of the white meat, fish and chicken, and also fat fish that is recommended at least twice a week. And what we don't like, 30 grams of non-salty nuts a day, because these are polyunsaturated fatty acids. With that, I thank you very much for your interest and for the honor listening to me. Grigory, thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. I think here you managed already to answer a number of questions we have received here. And by the way, during this plenary session, we are getting very many questions. Currently, we have more than 150 questions. Unfortunately, we are a little bit behind the schedule, so we cannot answer these questions now. But according to our tradition of Eurasian Association of Therapists, there are no unanswered questions. We will split questions into blocks, and All the questions would be answered later on. We will clarify the answers from the experts, and you will get these answers in our Telegram channel next week, 7-10 days after the conference. So if you can check our Telegram channel, you're welcome. If not, then this is EUAT official, and I also will ask administrators to provide the address of our Telegram channel there, or you can put into the search machine Eurasian Association of Therapists, where you can get all the answers to the questions which are not answered in the broadcast. So another challenge that Grigory mentioned, we have already received a number of questions. We speak about behavioral risk factors, but we have not yet tackled the issues of chronic stress, depression, psychological issues, psychological patterns, and this is another and also a very big topic. And by the next conference, no doubt, we will invite experts who will speak up fully here, because these are also important risk factors. And we are moving on. It's my greatest pleasure now to give the floor to Igor Fomin, who is the expert in the CHF. Igor, microphone is yours. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, dear colleagues. I'm very pleased to speak up at the opening ceremony of Eurasian Congress. I think heart failure for the last 3-4 years just surprises not only experts, not only researchers, but also doctors. Because the first position that we can say is that today we split heart failure into the two big categories. And this is either reduced or preserved ejection fraction. So all that story started at the beginning of the 21st century. Back in 2000, there were some first publications telling us that most probably that actually heart failure could behave very differently, and in this situation possibly it could be very different manifestation, reduce and preserve ejection fraction. So they are two different things. And in the recent years we start saying that yes, in fact, if we speak about reduced ejection fraction, so this is volume dependent heart failure, this is accumulation of fluid and further dilation of the chambers, and then reduction of the ejection fraction. But with preserved ejection fraction, there are totally different laws. This is aseptic inflammation, activity of interleukins, etc., etc. And the approaches here should be very, very different. So we go back to the 2007, and for the first time in a very huge study, up to 50,000 patients who were hospitalized into the hospitals of United States, optimized study with a heart failure, it has been shown that probably there is a contribution of very different patients. So first patients, they are up to 40%, and here we see the second accumulation of the patients, and this is about 56%. At the same time, Professor Wang already confirmed that most probably patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction have REF. There would be much lower rate of them, but have PEF, preserved ejection fraction. We will increase this pool. For the last 15 years, we start actively talking that most probably patients with the preserved ejection fraction have PEF patients, and there are more and more of them in all the countries. They have their own phenotypes. First is a clinical phenotype, and the recent Italian publication is telling us. So if this is a female with hypertension and diabetes and BMI more than 30, and here once again another important moment with GFR less than 60 millimeters per minute, liters per minute, and with atrial fibrillation and ischemic heart disease, they definitely have PEF. If we speak about males here, then as a priority is ischemic heart disease, it's elder age, diabetes, and arterial hypertension. And please appreciate here, we always speak about CKD with GFR less than 30. In parallel with so-called clinical phenotypes, there are also hemodynamic phenotypes. And why this association with hemodynamic phenotype is very important. It's all very simple because today we understand the level of blood pressure, heart rate, presence or absence of atrial fibrillation, chronic CKD, and definitely electrolyte disorders would lead to significant worsening of the patient's prognosis for patients with CHF if we do not control this situation. So here we see lots of phenotypes, and we clearly understand that there are patients with low and normal blood pressure, also with a high and low rate of heart rate, with atrial fibrillation, also ventricular contractility, and a separate patients with CHF associated with the electrolytes and electrolyte disorders, then not control hypertension. And please appreciate here another important aspect: patients before the discharge after decompensation. This is the most challenging cohort of the patients because the risks of mortality for this category of patients is the highest within the first 30 or 90 days after the discharge about decompensation. And patients with comorbidities, and they are requiring more and more frequently multidisciplinary teams to control all possible comorbidities to prevent decompensation, not only for heart failure, but also organs and systems that are included into the heart failure. Diagnostics. On the one hand, in 2021, we appreciated a revolution and for the diagnosis of heart failure. Now it's much easier to do it in terms of moderate or moderately reduced heart failure. Either are signs and symptoms and reduced ejection fraction, changed myocardial structure, and in fact, it confirms heart failure. But please appreciate here, as soon as we get into the HFpEF category, then we have huge tasks in order to confirm these not only structural but also functional changes of the heart. And then we appreciate left ventricular and myocardial mass index, also some hemodynamic parameters, and also the average pressure in the pulmonary artery. But the most important here, we need to confirm diagnostic change of left ventricular. So we reduced from the ratio we are where the parameter is higher than 9, and Europeans put a position of more aggressive. They believe it should be higher than 14. And let me draw your attention, only here we see natriuretic peptides.
Совершенно ясно, то обратите внимание, появляется еще один анализ, который называется средний фрагмент предсердного наtriuретического.
Another test shown here, and if it's less than 40 picomole per milliliter, then in this case we say that probably today these criteria of natriuretic peptide are needed mainly for screening and also for the exclusion of the diagnosis of heart failure. And that is why it is mentioned here, it's less than these levels, and we have to be absolutely sure that in this case we exclude heart failure. As soon as we start speaking about higher levels, especially for NT-proBNP, we should immediately understand that this is not only heart failure, but also any other possible disease which is associated with the fluid retention in the organism, and then it becomes less sensitive for the diagnosis of heart failure. So please appreciate here, in the brackets, we see the diluted form of the growth factor. This is a criteria which is very sensitive to the cause of heart failure. It is sensitive not only with a reduced ejection fraction, but also with preserved ejection fraction. That is why we will say that I think one day we will start using this parameter more actively to identify the prognosis of the patients. With that, currently, what is actively discussed are the troponins levels. in case of decompensation especially. Another important moment, which would be soon approved in the guidelines and in European guidelines, that's the fourth type of CHF, except low, intermediate, and preserved. Now there is next type, which is improved ejection fraction. That tells us about the possible. If with low fraction we can increase plus 10% with the proper treatment of CHF, then we can say that this is improved ejection fraction as we improve the prognosis of the outcome. So in fact, today, we are speaking about the next era of treatment, where we can move from low fraction to the moderately reduced, and possibly with time, if we intensify the treatment properly and active rehabilitation, specifically physical rehabilitation, and in this case, we can move even to the category of preserved ejection fraction. So what do we know today? We know that EE stress is very sensitive for the diagnosis. We actively discussed it with functional doctors.
Этот показатель, потому что требуется большее время. Но обратите внимание, есть два критерия. Е4 больше 9.
There are two criteria here. We say that heart failure probably has diastolic dysfunction. And then 14 or higher than 15, that is another type which is preserved. As soon it is the lower rate, then we immediately face with pathology of arterial hypertension and target organs. And we mix international studies about the efficacy of modern treatments. With that, today we could see that heart failure societies, they are trying to establish screening systems for the heart failure. And this is American system, which is telling us that it's better to deal with the clinical picture. And in this case, the probability of the diagnosis about preserved ejection fraction would be 95 threshold if we, from all these criteria shown here, on the right, if we see 7 points or higher, and then we are in the 95% confidential interval.
Чему ухудшается у данной категории пациентов, и можем говорить о том, что это большая вероятность постановки диагноза.
So that's the high probability of the diagnosis. The level of NT-proBNP and BNP does not influence the prognostic scale.
Показатель особенно NT-proBNP.
So most probably NT-proBNP and dramatic increase of more than 10,000 or 15,000 picogram per milliliter means take and act, because this is a very high risk of losing life prognosis. European guidelines, they study deeper the myocardium status. So here are stress tests, resonance tomography, scintigraphy, etc., genetic analysis to make precise diagnosis and to identify the etiology of CHF, to have strategic management of the patients for the improvement of the life prognosis. So what do we know today? We know that if we consider heart failure, then most probably the blockers of renin-angiotensin systems, beta blockers, and mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, and definitely SGLT2 inhibitors are effective for sure with reduced ejection fraction, with high probability, with moderately reduced and intermediate, and possibly they are effective in patients even with preserved ejection fraction. What do we understand from the maximum effect of treatment? First, this is precise examination of the patients before the discharge, to exclude congestion with a titration of diuretics and reduction of dose of diuretics. And another important moment,
при отсутствии отечного синдрома максимально быстро снижать дозы диуретиков.
And we should reduce the doses of diuretics because this is pro-arrhythmic effect. As soon as we speak about the baseline treatment, these are definitely the treatments that are proved with their efficacy. So this is the strategy of seamless follow-up. Acute decompensation could be seen only when the patient is discharged from the hospital within 30 days and was not followed by the doctor. And now please appreciate next factor, within 4 weeks. That is not initiating modified treatment for the patients. So with preserved ejection fraction, possibly 3 treatments, but at least 2. But in that case, we simply understand that if you reach target levels of hemodynamics, this is a level of 115, 130. So we go back to the situation. And it improves life prognosis. And a separate risk factor, active titration of treatments at the outpatient stage. Only in that case, we can change the prognosis of life of the patients. So, and this is the last position of recommendations of 2021. American and European. So active implementation of tools to reduce the risks of adverse events of medical treatments, control over the safety of baseline treatment, control diuretic treatment, and this is weighing of the patient schools, rehabilitation programs, and interaction with relatives. Only in this case, we can get maximum effect of treatment. What can we say about treatment today? So the first revolution in 2021, we clearly say that quadruple treatment using RAS blockers, beta blockers, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, and SGLT2 inhibitors, only these 4 options all together in a good proper doses, that means more than 50% from the standard dose, could really change the prognosis of life. At the same time, another important moment here, the evidence base is also very high. So this is a 1A or 1B evidence base level. This is sacubitril valsartan. But 1 means that if you don't administer one of these groups out of 5 treatments, but that means 4 directions of treatment that could worsen the prognosis of life. So if patients get ACE inhibitor, beta blocker, and mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, then we understand a worsening of the prognosis of life. And the same situation with sacubitril valsartan, dapagliflozin, and beta blocker. And then we clearly understand that the situation would not be manageable and the outcome would be negative. Why it happened? So that's first paradigm that reduces the risks of cardiovascular mortality and hospitalization versus enalapril. So golden treatment for the golden standard for CHF treatment with reduced ejection fraction. Please appreciate 80% here. And this is a reduction of the all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. What is another important thing here? We are saying today that we are considering anti-arrhythmic drugs as non-priority versus ventricular arrhythmias as the main reason for the mortality of patients with CHF. And also we consider beta blockers, sacubitril valsartan, and mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists as anti-arrhythmic treatments category of the patients with low ejection fraction. But in fact, in the paradigm, it has been confirmed, and already in 2016, in the heart failure guidelines, and in 2018 for arrhythmias, it has been confirmed for the patients with low ejection fraction with the presence of ventricular arrhythmias. So these 3 options are the preventions of sudden death. What is also very important here, we see that sacubitril/valsartan is one of the most important treatments that could stabilize CKD in patients with heart failure. At the same time, another important thing mentioned here, we see increased ejection fraction for this treatment that tells us that from a low ejection fraction, we could definitely switch patients to the interim, and some patients could move to the preserved ejection fraction with the improvement of prognosis of life. Next position that we are talking about, this is a change of understanding on the stable patient, what stable patient is. Please appreciate here, there are studies on the stable patients that are mentioned in the guidelines of 2016, European and American. So these are 4 weeks of a stable hemodynamics. Please appreciate here. So today we completely changed this ideology, and the level of pressure is 100 millimeters mercury with the absence of symptomatic hemodynamics within 6 hours. When the patient IV diuretics move to Perosa and no vasodilators within 6 hours, and then absence of ionotropes within 24 hours, then we can call a patient stable. Stable, that allows to tighten the treatments, all the treatments which are currently available in the real practice. So that's the first position, and this is what we confirm with the PIAVER study, where it has been shown this is 13 days, and this is a point after the acute decompensation of heart failure, where for the first 48 hours, patients normally die due to the arrhythmias and acute decompensation. That means lung edema and non-manageable hemodynamics. Then, from day 10 to 13, patients die with polyorganic failure. And during day 13, this is what we see, the curve starts splitting, and we see clear priority of sacubitril/valsartan. And the current evidence base is telling us that if in the period of hemodynamic stabilization, if we do not administer sacubitril/valsartan, then the preliminary results tell us that within the next 2 years, even after 8 weeks of switching from ACE inhibitors to sacubitril/valsartan, the curves would not be merging. So we are speaking about clear improvement of the life prognosis. And please appreciate here another important phrase presented by American experts for the heart failure in the modern parameters. And I'm saying about sacubitril/valsartan in patients with reduced ejection fraction, the treatment of ARNI provides a very high cost efficiency. So, dear colleagues, we always look at the cost price as a high, but at the same time, we need to understand that just one hospitalization because of decompensation is 70% for the state about the whole annual management of patients with heart failure. So that's most important slide. Four drugs altogether significantly improve life prognosis, reduces heart failure mortality by 50%, and the total mortality, all-cause mortality by 47% in case we administer all 4 treatments. So, with low ejection fraction, it is all very clear. Now we understand it's clinical inertia of the doctors that doesn't allow us to change the situation for the improvement of the life prognosis. Now we move to the preserved ejection fraction. So this is a new revolution. For the first time after Paragon study, we start saying that sacubitril/valsartan does not have any effect, and pay attention here, about placebo. And valsartan, I don't agree with that, that although the studies showed that unfortunately we cannot influence cardiovascular mortality and general mortality in patients more than 50%. Why? It's all very simple. These are very different groups of patients, and very frequently we see here heart failure and also patients with some other manifestations, for example, with COPD, patients with anemic syndrome, etc., etc. Also, we see today that the curves started splitting very fast, and this is very important moment. Improvement of the quality of life, increase of compliance, and also reduction of renal worsening by 50%. It tells us that this is safety profile for the treatment of these patients. And this is about GFR, more than 15 milliliters per minute. So the next position is here. It was shown that all females reacted very positively to this treatment, and all population, males and females, with a fraction more than 57, then gave us improvement of the result. And now please appreciate here, in fact, in this cohort of patients, we saw the reduction of the primary endpoint, a reduction of mortality risks, and also heart failure hospitalization. And separately, we got here a reduction of hospitalization risks. And I want to draw your attention to the first 30 days. So that is improvement of the prognosis of life, and these are combined endpoints. So we will remember this figure. So for the first 30 days after decompensation in any patient with a low or preserved ejection fraction for the treatment of sacubitril/valsartan, we just reduce risks of cardiovascular mortality on the one hand, and another important thing is a reduction of risks in the development of secondary hospitalizations. So please appreciate here 27%. 27%. This is important. So the other important parameter, which is a diluted form of growth factor, and it is very active parameter for the significance. So we are saying that we are preventing fibrosis and necrosis in patients with preserved ejection fraction. And most probably, we can imagine that that would be mainly anti-arrhythmic effect. And let me repeat once again that combined renal endpoint was definitely obtained. In parallel, in 2021, we finished another study, Imperial Preserved, which is telling us that, yes, of course, combined endpoints and this reduction of risk of cardiovascular mortality and hospitalization, it could be reduced by 21% only if we administer SGLT2 inhibitors. So that's another study, Deliver, which is showing the same confirmation. Then the use of dapagliflozin reduces cardiovascular mortality and heart failure hospitalization already within the first 30 days after the administration. But please appreciate here, in case we administer this treatment within the first 30 days after the acute decompensation of the heart failure and stabilization of hemodynamics, then unfortunately we are not getting these points. So please appreciate here on the right, we can see that in this situation still SGLT2 inhibitors, they are not properly working. But this is again a big plus. Why? Because we have ARNI, sacubitril/valsartan, and in this environment, it is actually effective. And now it is 2022, and Americans are offering a very important approach. First, diuretics in edemas, they should be administered. Now, inhibitors of SGLT2 inhibitors should be administered with a priority. ARNI should be administered with a priority. We should prioritize it, let's say, and here it's in low ejection fraction no sartans, and also antagonists to mineralocorticoid receptors should be administered as well. Today, we are saying that this is just half a year after American recommendations, and definitely diuretics should be administered as well. Mineralocorticoid receptors antagonists, well, this is a position of 2BB, and they are not yet effective in here. So that means as well as sartans. We don't have evidence-based data here, but please appreciate here. So this is a very good position for sacubitril/valsartan and SGLT2 for CHF patients with HFpEF. Sacubitril/valsartan is working along all the line. Acute decompensation, HFrEF and HFpEF. So today we are saying that ARNI proved its efficacy in any phenotype of heart failure. The use of sacubitril/valsartan in patients with preserved ejection fraction about the heart failure and progression of kidney failure. So, and if this is less than 57% or females of any ejection fraction, the earlier sacubitril valsartan is administered, the more effective could be efficacy of treatment in patients regardless. The priority, the patients with preserved ejection fraction, and this is from 45 to 60, regardless the diabetes, regardless the atrial fibrillation, in the stabilization of hemodynamics after acute decompensation of heart failure. And definitely it's better 30 days after decompensation, and the use of ARNI and SGLT2 inhibitors has potentiating effect, especially within the first 30 days after the incident of acute decompensation of heart failure. So, but I put a very big but here. All studies for the efficacy of patients is confirmed that the most challenging task here are patients with HFpEF, and the most difficult is to make the correct diagnosis. And we need to search for more sensitive criteria for the diagnosis making. And with that, I thank you for your attention. You're welcome. Igor, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I'm pretty sure we will have many questions. As we are a little bit behind the schedule, we cannot answer questions in the plenary session, but all questions would be pulled into blocks and they would be presented in the Telegram channel. So please follow us and you will get the answers from all the experts. And now, Igor mentioned the problem, and I also mentioned that in my introductory part, and all the speakers also emphasize the importance of the fact that today CKD and manifestation of the CKD as other nosology is probably one of the most perspective directions in the medicine, and this is the area that should be very actively studied. So new ways of treatment, new approaches to the diagnosis, and the most important to the understanding of pathogenesis will help us to preserve and to consider not only kidney as a separate phenomenon here, but to put it together. And with my greatest pleasure and honor, I'm happy to give the floor to our nephrology expert, and this is Professor Batyushin. He will speak about diabetic nephropathy, and most probably he will speak about a new phenotype, proteinuric phenotypes, and other types of phenotypes. So, Mikhail, microphone is yours, Professor Batyushin. Dear Alexander, dear colleagues, let me speak about very new approaches to the issues of diagnosis of diabetic disease, maybe some new types of visions of treatment of this disease. It looks like since Friedrich Banting periods that for the first time used insulin, which happened 100 years ago. And this year, in fact, we are celebrating using insulin here. So here on the right, you can see Leonard Thompson. So this boy, and his mother changes him. So this is before and after insulin. So after that, he lived for about next 15 years and then died. So since the time of discovery and implementation of anti-diabetic treatments in the clinical practice, the problem of diabetes is not yet resolved. So today we speak not about only a problem of diabetes, but also about the pandemic of micro and macrovascular complications of diabetes. So today we have pandemic of CKD that actually happens due to the diabetes, So this is mainly diabetic kidney disease. But what do we else know? That insulin and other antidiabetics, they resolved the problem of micro and macrovascular complications. They have not resolved it. So from this slide, we could see that every 8th, 9th resident of this planet, they already have CKD, and the main reason for CKD development is actually diabetes. If we put arterial hypertension here, which is actually independent reason for the kidney injuries. So these two diseases, they dramatically guide the high prevalence of CKD. And the further is the diabetes, the longer the patient is having diabetes, the probability of kidney disease is increasing. That's a big challenge, because if we appreciate here, so some cross-sectional data, one of them is done in 1990 and the latest one in 1917. So you see how the prevalence is changed and the contribution of diabetes in the diabetic nephropathy, the contribution into the CKD. If back in 1990s we could speak about the moderate leadership of type 2 diabetes, and then if we look for 2017, so that's absolute victory of diabetes over other diseases for the development of CKD. So we have to say that today, beside hemodynamic reasons that play a big role, very big role for the development of diabetic kidney disease, so this is hyperfiltration, hypertension, so hypervolemia, this is also activization of controlling system of volemia and the pressure in the human organism at systemic level and also at the local renal level. So more and more frequently, we start speaking about the role of inflammation and fibrosis. That means humoral system of kidney reaction towards hyperglycemia, towards other metabolic disorders, which are typical to the diabetes. So today, more and more frequently, we discuss issues of metabolic disorders, which is activation of oxidative stress, activation of number of metabolic system, lipid toxicity, and changes of gut microbiome. And I will tell you few words about it. So that's the challenge of glucose toxicity as the only challenge in the development of the macrovascular complications in diabetes is very important, including diabetic kidney disease. So currently, by now, it is moved by the whole complex of other problems that can happen in diabetic patients. And it's not a secret. There are categories of diabetic patients where we can successfully control glycemic profile using modern anti-diabetic treatments, but it does not resolve the issue of the development of micro and macrovascular complications. As an example, let me give you the study which was published few months ago, and this is a study at the particular genetic line of rats, and they were performed a nephrectomy. Then diabetic kidney disease was artificially initiated. So these are rats with so-called leaky gut, where we see so-called translocation of microorganism, Klebsiella oxytoc, with the development in the gut, the local inflammation and systemic inflammation, with a preliminary increase of level of IL-17, so-called IL-17 dominant inflammation. So it appeared to be that in these rates, IL-17 causes the progression of diabetic nephropathy. So it may look like, well, the problem of the leaky gut in the wide clinical practice, this is the phenomenon of functional and organic disorders, big persisting challenges of the gut. So where is the problem and where is the problem of diabetic nephropathy? So it appears to be that they are very close to each other. From mechanistic understanding of diabetic kidney disease, and in fact, we spoke already about intraglomerular hyperfiltration. So today, as an argument, we look at the damages in the kidney diabetes, such structures like endothelium of the vascular wall, damage of the podocytes, and most important thing, in albuminuria, involvement of the epithelium and damages of interstitial tissue. We have to say that all in all, hyperglycemia, beside glycation of proteins, oxidative stress, hemodynamic disorders, intraglomerular, it also causes the complex of humoral changes, and they cannot be kept out of attention. Immune system, immunocompetent cells, mononuclear phagocytes. Here, all that participates in remodeling of the kidneys in patients with diabetic kidney disease. This is what Alexandra was speaking in the announcement of my presentation. So today we identify classical albuminuric phenotype, which is more or less clear to all of us. So this is podocytopathias, this is involvement of podocytes with a reduced synthesis of nephrin, with a thickening of glomerular basal membrane. There is a hyperproduction of matrix, and all components of glomerular matrix are not removed properly from the membrane due to the weakness of metalloproteinases activities, and this is how membrane is becoming thicker, so more rigid, and pores are bigger, and albumin is dropped down here. And this is also a detachment of podocytes in the glomerular membrane, and then extension of filtration space with reducing barrier function for albumin. And there is a bigger question here about non-albuminuric phenotype. Now speaking about the classical involvement of podocytes. So here we can identify at least seven main hits that could be done by diabetes on the podocytes. So first is hyperglycemia, so that is glucose toxicity, which is not cancelled. The second is hemodynamic hit, and it is related with so-called increased shear stress, that increased filtration volume that goes through the membrane and hits podocytes, facilitates creation podocyte-hepatic albuminuria. And beside that, there is also mechanical stretch, fixation of podocytes in the glomerular membrane, because that's the pressure, that's a stretch. And finally, it's a sweet blood. This is hypervolemia. So the membrane is stretched, and here you see the stems of podocytes. That again leads to the detachment of podocytes from glomerular membrane and development of albuminuria. So this is oxidative stress. So this is changes of glycocalyx, cytoskeleton, influence of different cytokine components to the podocytes. This is endocannabinoid system of podocytes, and this is exactly what I mean. Endocannabinoid receptors, they're actually located in the nervous system, but in fact podocytes, these are cells which are also expressing in their surface these type of receptors. And currently, there are interesting studies carried out in the experimental nephrology with the use of drugs that could influence endocannabinoid receptors with an objective to try to cause a renoprotective effect in diabetic patients. So this is also lipid toxicity, high level of cholesterol. So this is not atherosclerosis of the renal arteries. So this is direct cell lipid toxicity in patients with diabetic kidney disease, non-albuminuric form of diabetic kidney disease. So normally, most frequently, this is a female problem. So this is a problem of the elderly age patients with a lower level of HbA1c. In such patients, we see rarer diabetic retinopathy. Also, we rarely use RAS blockers in the medical history. And there are no indications here, So, for example, normal blood pressure, and if we see GFR reduction but no albuminuria, and to a certain extent, it may limit the use of RAS blockers. We have to say that the prognosis of such patients is to a certain extent better versus patients with albuminuric renal damage, but not very good as well. And this is prevalence of non-albuminuric form is also increasing. But if we look at meta-analysis of very, very large studies, it appears to be that 10-20% of all diabetic forms, this is so-called non-albuminuric phenotype. And if the prognosis for the total mortality, cardiovascular hospitalization due to the CHF, progression CKD, non-albuminuric kidney disease looks a bit better than in case of albuminuric, reduction of kidney. Then, in the situation when there is no albuminuria, but there is isolated kidney reduction, so this form is competing to the influence of endpoints with non-albuminuric phenotype. Non-albuminuric phenotype of diabetic kidney disease increases the total mortality, increases the risks of cardiovascular outcomes in MACE groups. So what do we see here in case of non-diabetic type of kidney involvement? We could see focal and segmentary involvement expansion of mesangial. We can see it also in 1/3 of the cases, most frequently in females. An influence of estrogens here, well, it is started properly. We can identify here minor episodes, secondary episodes of a renal kidney injury in patients with quite stable and slow reduction of GFR. It could be seen in 43% of the patients, vascular interventions in 37, and last but not least, glomerulosclerosis, interstitial fibrosis, almost in all the patients with non-albuminuric phenotype. We have to say that diabetic nephropathy actually non-homogeneous at all. I'm not diving into the depth now, but this is classification of diabetic nephropathy. This is American Society of Nephrologists. It gives us the counting of all these non-homogeneous. And what if it is implemented very actively? So that means nephrobiopsy should be actively used in patients with diabetic nephropathy. And also there is another complex, for example, nodular glomerulopathy, where we do differential diagnosis with diabetic kidney disease, and it can be done, unfortunately, with morphological analysis. But what can we do if this is a diabetic patient with hypertension? So here we see manifestation of what? Is this hypertensive nephropathy, or is this just diabetic nephropathy? So currently, in the scientific forms, they offered to mention it like a general term, vascular nephropathy, because at the level of some clinical studies, it's very difficult to differentiate. And the test for albuminuria, which is actively used, and test for GFR, which is actively used, allows to identify but not to differentiate the problem. And here are the risk scales. Mainly, they are for albuminuric phenotype of the diabetic kidney disease, but what to do with non-albuminuric phenotype? What to do with so-called vascular damage of kidneys? Because in the basis of that, we see not only diabetes, but also arterial hypertension. Well, in fact, we have a question to change the definition, the borderlines of diabetic kidney disease in patients with diabetic involvement. So now we are considering the option of tubular markers, markers of the podocytes order and the endothelial disorder as a markers of aging, albuminuria, and GFR, because they are reacting faster, because they help to identify the problem before. The question whether we need to do it or not, well, that's a question for the next decades, and what to do with that. The problem here is that majority of the clinical trials, they're mainly focused on the resolution of the problem with albuminuric phenotype. Diabetic kidney disease. So that's a classic management of the patients with diabetes and nephropathy, mainly focused on the patients with albuminuric forms. And here we're trying to get rid of this phenotype and to get therapeutic solution for non-albuminuric phenotype. And actually, it happens because of SGLT2 blockers, and actually that's total the group of RAS blockers. We have to say that this is a serious challenge of treatment. So please appreciate here, this year, American Society of Diabetes and Kidneys, they changed the approach to the assessment of target level of blood pressure in patients with diabetic kidney disease. And by the way, look at these target levels, 140 by 90, 120 to 80, 130 to 80. Please appreciate how complicated and how differentiated is scheme of this approach. Definitely, it is not covering and including our country, but nevertheless, the problem of diabetic kidney involvement is very challenging, not only in the diagnostic heterogeneity, but also it is getting worse for the treatment heterogeneity. This is worsening and more complicated. And this is my final slide. I wanted to show you that today, as possible options for therapeutical effects, we could consider the drugs from very different areas that could influence metabolic oxidative processes, cytokine reaction. And I do hope that in all this very complicated process of diagnosis and treatment of diabetic kidney disease, we will find the proper niches for the wider clinical practice. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Терапевтов не стоит на месте и предлагает современному врачу новые возможности для совершенствования своих знаний и навыков. Приглашаем вас принять участие в новом проекте, посвященном формированию единой цепи сердечно-сосудистого континуума от артериальной гипертензии до хронической сердечной недостаточности. Присоединяйтесь к научно-просветительской инициативе «Пирамида лечения ХСН» от понимания основ к сложным решениям. Проект НПИ посвящен наиболее актуальным практическим темам в области внутренних болезней и кардиологии. Каждый отдельный урок представляет собой узкую тему, рассмотренную ведущими экспертами Евразийской ассоциации терапевтов. Уроки состоят из видеолекций, подборки актуальной мировой литературы, инструментов для практической деятельности и заданий для самопроверки. Курс рассчитан на несколько недель. Участие бесплатное. По завершению обучения вы получите сертификат о его прохождении. Курс «Пирамида лечения ХСН» от понимания основ к сложным решениям доступен после регистрации на сайте и представлен в разделе «Образование». Следите за выходом новых уроков на сайте и в наших социальных сетях.